Marcus Ferreira couldn't remember a version of his childhood that existed before he became responsible for managing his mother's moods, though he understood, intellectually, that there must have been a handful of years, before he was 12, when Deborah Ferreira had been a different kind of presence in his life, less volatile, less prone to the sudden, disproportionate outbursts that would come to define most of his adolescence and, eventually, most of his adult relationship with her. His father, Antonio, had left when Marcus was 11, a departure that arrived without much warning and left in its wake a mother whose grief seemed to transform, over the following year, into something harder and more combustible than simple sadness, a persistent, low-grade anger that found new targets almost daily, that erupted without predictable pattern, that Marcus learned, through painful trial and error, could sometimes be managed if he moved carefully enough through their shared household. He'd been 12 the first time he successfully talked his mother down from a full-blown confrontation with a neighbor over a property line dispute that had, in Deborah's telling, become an existential referendum on whether anyone in the neighborhood respected her. He remembered the specific relief of watching her anger deflate under his careful, practiced reasoning, remembered the strange, complicated pride he'd felt at having successfully defused something that could have escalated badly, and remembered, too, how quickly that skill became expected of him rather than remarkable, his mother relying on his intervention more and more as the years progressed, treating his ability to manage her moods as simply a fact of their household rather than a burden he was carrying that no 12-year-old should have had to carry. By high school, Marcus had developed an entire internal toolkit specifically calibrated to his mother's particular temperament. He knew which topics to avoid raising during her bad weeks, knew how to redirect conversations before they veered toward whatever grievance was currently occupying her attention, knew the specific tone of voice that could sometimes talk her back from the edge of an outburst before it fully materialized. He applied these skills not just within their own household, but increasingly at family gatherings, extended family events, any situation where Deborah's temper posed a risk to the broader social fabric she seemed only intermittently aware she was capable of damaging. Relatives had come to expect it of him too, over the years, an aunt pulling him aside at a wedding to ask if he could have a word with your mother about some comment she'd made, a cousin calling him directly rather than Deborah herself to sort out a dispute about holiday plans, the family's collective, unspoken agreement that Marcus functioned as Deborah's designated translator and damage control specialist, a role nobody had ever formally assigned him, but that everyone had simply come to rely on. He'd married Renee Alvarez at 28, drawn to her specific combination of warmth and quiet strength, her ability to remain calm under pressure in a way that felt, to Marcus, like an entirely foreign skill set compared to what he'd grown up navigating. Renee had met Deborah early in their relationship and had, from the very beginning, approached her future mother-in-law with a careful, diplomatic patience that Marcus had found both admirable and, if he was honest with himself in his more reflective moments, slightly heartbreaking, watching his wife absorb the same kind of careful management he'd spent his whole life performing. Understanding that she was doing it partly out of genuine kindness and partly, he suspected, because she'd quickly recognized what kind of family dynamic she was marrying into and had decided, consciously, that peace was worth the effort. Deborah had never fully warmed to Renee in the way Marcus had hoped she might, maintaining instead a low, persistent undercurrent of criticism that surfaced most reliably during family gatherings, comments about Renee's cooking, her parenting choices with their 2 children, her career as a physical therapist, which Deborah occasionally described to relatives as not a real medical profession. Despite Renee's extensive clinical training, Marcus had absorbed these comments over the years the same way he'd absorbed everything else from his mother, finding ways to smooth them over, to redirect conversations, to quietly apologize to Renee afterward for his mother's behavior while somehow never quite managing to confront Deborah directly about the pattern itself. Their children, Lily, now 12, and her younger brother Theo, 9, had grown up witnessing this same dynamic play out at nearly every family gathering, absorbing without fully understanding the specific choreography their father performed to keep Deborah's moods from derailing every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday dinner that included their grandmother. Lily, old enough now to notice patterns more consciously than she once had asked Marcus once, after a particularly tense Thanksgiving, why Grandma always seemed angry, and Marcus had given her some careful, diplomatic answer about how everyone processes grief differently, an explanation that satisfied his daughter's curiosity in the moment without addressing the deeper, more troubling question of why he continued exposing his family to a dynamic he'd spent decades managing rather than confronting. This particular Christmas had been planned, months in advance, as a larger gathering than usual. Renee's mother, Carmen, visiting from out of state for the first time to spend the holiday with her daughter's family, along with several of Marcus's cousins and their families. Nearly 20 people total gathered in Deborah's spacious dining room for the traditional Christmas dinner she insisted on hosting every year despite Marcus's occasional, gentle suggestions that rotating the responsibility might ease some of the pressure that seemed to accumulate around the holiday's preparation. Renee had offered, weeks earlier, to bring a few dishes to supplement Deborah's traditional menu, an offer Deborah had accepted with the kind of surface-level graciousness that Marcus had learned, over years of experience, often concealed a more complicated undercurrent of resentment about anyone else's contributions to what she considered fundamentally her occasion to control. Renee had chosen to bring her grandmother's stuffing recipe specifically because it carried genuine sentimental weight for her, a dish her own grandmother, Isabel, had made every Christmas throughout Renee's childhood, using a specific blend of herbs and a particular bread base that differed from more conventional stuffing recipes, but that Renee associated with some of her warmest childhood memories. She'd mentioned this to Marcus while preparing the dish the night before, describing with genuine warmth the specific holiday mornings she remembered from her own childhood, the smell of her grandmother's kitchen, the particular comfort of a recipe that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in her family. Marcus had encouraged her to bring it, understanding how much it meant to her, not fully anticipating the specific collision it would create with his mother's rigid, unexamined expectations about what Christmas dinner was supposed to look like. The dinner itself had proceeded smoothly enough through its early stages, the extended family settling into the familiar rhythms of a large holiday gathering, Carmen making polite conversation with relatives she was meeting for the first time, the children occupied with a new board game in the next room while the adults finished setting the table and bringing out the final dishes. It was during this final stage of preparation, Renee carrying her grandmother's stuffing dish to its designated spot on the table, that Deborah's comment first surfaced, a remark about the dish's unfamiliar smell, delivered initially in a tone that might have passed in a different family for simple curiosity, but that Marcus recognized immediately, from decades of careful study, as the opening note of something considerably more volatile building underneath. Renee had smiled through the initial comment, the practiced, diplomatic smile Marcus had watched her deploy at nearly every family gathering for the past 6 years, and had explained, with genuine warmth, that the recipe came from her grandmother Isabel, that the blend of sage and a particular Portuguese seasoning her grandmother had always used gave it a flavor profile different from more conventional American stuffing, but one that carried deep sentimental value for her own family's holidays. She'd offered, in the same breath, to bring Deborah's preferred version alongside her own next year, a gesture of accommodation that Marcus recognized, watching from across the room, as exactly the kind of careful, generous diplomacy Renee had always extended toward his mother despite years of receiving very little of the same in return. Deborah's response had escalated faster than Marcus expected, even accounting for his mother's established patterns. "This isn't how it's supposed to taste," she'd said, her voice rising loud enough to carry across the dining room and silence the smaller conversations happening around the table. "Marcus grew up with real stuffing, not whatever foreign thing this is. I don't understand why you couldn't just make it the normal way for once." The word foreign had landed with a specific, ugly weight, given that Renee's family was of Portuguese descent, the same heritage, notably, as Marcus's own father's side of the family, a detail that made Deborah's comment carry an edge of hypocrisy that seemed to briefly register on several relatives' faces around the table, an uncomfortable, collective recognition that something uglier than simple culinary preference was surfacing in the room. Renee had held her composure remarkably well, given the comment's specific cruelty, responding with the same measured, diplomatic tone she'd used throughout. "It's my grandmother's recipe, Deborah. I think it's delicious, and I understand you might prefer something different, but I'd appreciate it if we could just enjoy the meal without making this into something bigger than it needs to be. It was this response, measured, reasonable, entirely appropriate by any standard Marcus could imagine applying to the situation, that seemed to trigger something in Deborah that none of them had anticipated. Marcus would spend months afterward trying to understand exactly what had shifted in that moment, whether it was the specific calm of Renee's tone, some accumulated resentment finally reaching a breaking point, or simply the particular alchemy of stress and old grievances that sometimes produces behavior entirely disproportionate to its immediate trigger. Whatever the cause, Deborah's face had contorted with a fury Marcus recognized from his childhood, the specific expression that had once preceded her worst outbursts at neighbors, at relatives, at anyone who'd triggered her particular combination of grief and rage in the years following his father's departure. What happened next unfolded in under 3 seconds, too fast for Marcus to intervene even if some part of him had recognized, in advance, what was coming. Deborah crossed the short distance between herself and Renee and slapped her across the face, the sound cracking through the dining room with a sharpness that seemed to freeze everyone present in the exact position they'd occupied a half-second earlier, Carmen's hand still holding a serving spoon suspended over a dish, a cousin's fork halfway to her mouth. Lily standing frozen in the doorway between the dining room and the living room where the children had been playing, having wandered back in at exactly the wrong moment to witness her grandmother strike her mother across the face. Renee's hand rose slowly to her cheek, her eyes wide with a shock that seemed to take a full second to fully register, the room around her equally frozen in the specific, suspended silence that follows genuine violence in a space where nobody expected it. Carmen's serving spoon clattered onto the table, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Somewhere behind Lily, Theo's voice asked, in the small, confused tone of a 9-year-old sensing something has gone badly wrong without fully understanding what. What happened? Marcus stood roughly 8 feet away, having been in the process of bringing water glasses to the table when the slap occurred, and felt something happen inside his chest that he would spend the following months trying to fully articulate. First to himself and later to a therapist, he began seeing specifically to process what this Christmas had unlocked in him. It wasn't quite anger, though anger was certainly present. It was something closer to a structural collapse, the sudden, complete recognition that every mechanism he'd built over 22 years to manage his mother's behavior had just proven itself catastrophically insufficient, that all his careful diplomacy and diffusion and damage control had never actually protected anyone, had simply delayed and redirected a fundamental problem that had just physically struck the person he loved most in the world. He didn't immediately move to his usual scripts. He didn't reach for the deflecting joke that might have eased the room's tension, didn't pull his mother aside for a quiet, urgent conversation about needing to apologize, didn't perform any of the exhausting choreography that had defined nearly every family gathering of his adult life. He simply stood very still for a moment, looking at his mother, feeling the specific, accumulated weight of every previous Christmas he'd spent managing her instead of protecting the people who actually deserved his protection. "Marcus," Deborah said, her voice already shifting into the register she used when she needed him to fix something, the same tone she'd used 1,000 times before to summon his intervention. "Tell her she can't just." "Get your coat," Marcus said, cutting her off, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including himself. "You need to leave." Deborah's face shifted from fury to genuine confusion, apparently having expected, on some deep, unexamined level, that Marcus would perform his usual function of translation and mitigation rather than direct confrontation. "Excuse me? This is my house, Marcus, and that woman insulted." "She didn't insult anything," Marcus said, his voice remaining level even as something fierce and long-buried finally surfaced fully into his expression. "She explained where a recipe came from and offered to make yours too next year. You hit my wife, Mom. In front of our children. In front of her mother, who you're meeting for the first time today." He looked around the room, taking in the frozen, shocked faces of relatives who'd clearly never witnessed anything like this at a Ferreira family gathering before, and felt something settle into place with a clarity that had eluded him for over 2 decades. "I need you to leave. Now." Deborah's expression cycled rapidly through several stages: confusion, indignation, a flash of something that might have been genuine shock at her own actions finally registering, and then, predictably, a retreat into defensive anger. "I am not leaving my own house because you're taking her side over your own mother's, after everything I've—" "This isn't about taking sides," Marcus said. "This is about you hitting someone. That's not a disagreement to mediate, Mom. That's violence, and I'm not managing it away this time the way I've managed everything else for 20 years. Carmen had moved to Renee's side by this point, gently checking the reddening mark spreading across her daughter's cheek, her own expression carrying a controlled fury that Marcus recognized, distantly, as the appropriate response he should have modeled himself years earlier for every smaller slight his mother had directed at his wife. "I think," Carmen said, her voice tight but measured, "that we should call the police, given what just happened." The suggestion landed in the room with its own kind of shock, several relatives exchanging uncertain glances, clearly unused to the idea that a family conflict, however serious, might warrant actual legal intervention rather than the usual private, internal family reckoning. Marcus felt himself hesitate for only a moment before responding. "That's Renee's decision," he said, looking toward his wife rather than his mother for the first time since the slap had occurred. "Whatever you want to do, I'll support it completely." Renee, still holding her cheek, looked at Marcus for a long moment, some silent communication passing between them that seemed to carry the full weight of 6 years of watching him manage his mother instead of confronting her. "I don't want to press charges," she said finally, her voice steadier than Marcus expected. "But I'm not staying in this house another minute, and I don't think I can be around her again until something actually changes." "That's fair," Marcus said. "That's completely fair." He turned back to his mother, who stood near the table with an expression that had settled into something between wounded indignation and genuine, dawning alarm at the trajectory events were taking. "Mom, I need you to leave. I'll help you get your coat, or you can call a cab, but you're not staying in this room with my family for the rest of tonight." "Marcus, please," Deborah said, her voice cracking slightly, some genuine fear finally surfacing beneath the anger. "It's Christmas. Don't do this." "You did this," Marcus said. "Not me. I've spent my whole life fixing things you break, Mom, and I'm not doing it anymore. Not tonight, and I don't think ever again. Not the way I used to." Deborah left 20 minutes later, driven by a cousin who volunteered, awkwardly, to take her home given the general consensus that Marcus shouldn't be the one to do it, and the remaining dinner proceeded in a strange, subdued atmosphere entirely unlike anything the family had previously experienced at one of these gatherings. Quieter, more careful, everyone still processing what they'd witnessed, but also, Marcus noticed, oddly more relaxed in a way he couldn't quite pin down until later. Once he had space to reflect, it was the specific relief, he eventually realized, of an entire room full of people no longer needing to brace themselves for whatever might come next from Deborah, a tension so constant and familiar that most of them had stopped consciously registering it until it was suddenly, dramatically absent. Marcus drove Renee and the children home early that evening, skipping the dessert course entirely, and spent the following weeks in a kind of quiet, deliberate reckoning with the pattern he'd maintained for over 2 decades. He didn't call his mother the next day to check on her, didn't reach out to smooth things over with relatives who'd witnessed the incident, didn't perform any of the exhausting damage control that would once have felt automatic and unavoidable. He let the silence sit, uncomfortable as it was, understanding for the first time that his lifelong role as the family fixer had never actually protected anyone from his mother's volatility. It had simply protected Deborah from ever facing the natural consequences of her own behavior, at the direct cost of everyone else's safety and dignity. Deborah called repeatedly over the following weeks, her messages shifting gradually from wounded indignation to genuine, halting attempts at apology, though Marcus noticed, listening to each voicemail with a new, careful skepticism, that her apologies always seemed to arrive wrapped in justifications about stress, about feeling disrespected, about Renee's own supposed contribution to the conflict, apologies that fell short, again and again, of the unconditional accountability the situation actually required. He didn't return most of the calls immediately, giving himself the space he'd never previously allowed to actually consider what kind of relationship, if any, he wanted to maintain with his mother going forward, rather than simply defaulting to his old, automatic pattern of managing her back into good graces regardless of what she'd done to earn that effort. Renee, for her part, began quietly asking, during their own private conversations that winter, whether Marcus had ever considered therapy, not for their marriage, which remained solid throughout the crisis, but for himself, for the specific, exhausting patterns he'd spent his entire adult life performing without ever fully examining where they'd come from or what they'd cost him. Marcus started seeing a therapist named Dr. Adiz Nwosu in January, and spent much of that first year in therapy slowly unpacking the specific architecture of his childhood role as his mother's fixer, understanding, gradually, that stopping the pattern wasn't a betrayal of his mother but rather the first genuinely protective thing he'd ever done. Not for her, but for the family he'd built and had, for too many years, allowed to absorb the cost of a role he should never have had to occupy in the first place.